Welcome to Transformed and Transformational, a Teach Beyond podcast. I'm Keane.
And I'm Heather. We're here to explore what it means to be transformed in our own lives and how that overflows to living lives of transformational impact in our communities.
Today we have Brian Delamont, Teach Beyond's Executive VP, on the podcast today for our monthly spiritual development conversation. In this season, we've been having conversations about transformation in Scripture.
And today we're focusing specifically on difficulties as transformation. And actually, a few weeks ago, we had an episode with a few teachers in Teach Beyond who demonstrated great resilience and perseverance. I think you guys have both heard this conversation of pioneering new school projects and navigating so many challenges along the way. So I guess we have a little bit of a theme going here.
Yeah, absolutely we do. And it's interesting to see, to hear these teachers as they walk through the challenges that were there for starting up their own school projects too. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. And we've also had this series of special 70th anniversary episodes this month. And, anytime you look back at the history and especially that long of a history of an organization, there are many challenges that come up in that. And we think about the transformations that have happened in not only lives, but the organization. So as we look at difficulties and challenges as transformation, that goes right along with the 70th anniversary theme too.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That last week's episode with Jack Stenicus, I want to just drop a quick story here. When
Yeah.
I was young and thinking about my involvement in missions, my first wife, Sonia, and I were literally just back in the day writing a letter to what was then Jan's team. And Jack was the guy who responded to our letter.
Oh,
And
wow.
just his welcome, his way of saying, you know what? Let's see what God has here for you guys, launched us on a journey that, like, here almost 40 years later,
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
just been so blessed, and
Mm.
God's shown up in so many ways. So yeah, it's lovely to see how all these connections over time, God's leading in our lives, even through some really difficult stuff sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is amazing to see kind of the lineage of Jack's history and then how that quickly transitions into your history with that letter and just how it carries on.
Yeah,
hmm And
absolutely.
both of you have taken time to be doing other ministries, other types of roles, investing in your families over the years. But that's brought us to today and getting to serve alongside these amazing people in our organization. So, yeah, we're grateful for that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's those little everyday things that
Mm.
really make such a difference in our lives, and sometimes we don't think they do. So, speaking of little everyday things, let's talk about something in this first question for today's episode. So what's something that you need to do every day, but maybe find difficult to do? Like, it seems like there's always something sort of in the course of a week. Maybe it is writing a letter or answering an email now, that you just wish you didn't have to do, or wish that it would go more easily when you need to do it. I've got
Uh-huh.
two things that immediately come to mind, and they're a little bit frivolous, but the first is like computer and app updates. Actually, we just experienced me having some difficulties with my computer, and here we are. So we're back, and it's good. But it seems like, for an app update, just when you know where everything is, they change the app, and you're like, okay, where was that? I know I used to be able to do this. The other thing, and apologies to my very kind and lovely dental hygienist, I just don't like flossing. And so it's one of those things that, yeah, it's good for me, but I just really don't enjoy it. How about you guys? Heather,
Mm.
Kian, what's sort of one of those little difficulties in life?
Mm, well, obviously, there are plenty of things. And I'd say having enough time for everything that I want or need to do is the hardest part of this for me. So, you mentioned writing letters, writing emails. For me, it's just getting to the bottom of my email inbox or to do list. It can feel like an impossible task to just reach the end. And I'd love to be an inbox zero girl. Like, this is an actual thing and a way of managing your inbox. That is not me. I'm
Mm,
still aspiring to be that. So, just answering the volume of emails and doing so well is something that I'd like to be able to get through.
Yeah. I know I've mentioned on the podcast before that I've been doing Duolingo for a long time. I have a really good streak going. But the reality is that I mainly do it at night at the very end and I don't talk to it. I have it on mute. So I'm really not getting the full experience. And I would love to actually be able to do it more intentionally and do it earlier in the morning when I have more time to focus and actually learn. Because right now I'm kind of just checking the box and not actually investing in the learning
Yeah.
side of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it just becomes a bit of a grind, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So the things that we've just mentioned, they're pretty minor in the
Mhm.
scope of our lives, but they are still things that we find have a degree of difficulty to them. And that's one of the interesting things of difficulties or problems or obstacles or crises, whatever you may want to call them. They come in different types and they impact each one of us differently. Sometimes what's easy for someone may be extremely difficult for someone else. And as we're about to enter into a conversation about difficulties as transformation, I really want us to keep in mind both the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God. The sovereignty of God, He's in control and He is good. He leads us into this opportunity to have difficulties and trials become part of the transformation that He longs for us to experience in order to become all that He intends. But we also live in a broken world. And so we experience things just because sin broke everything. So as we continue to look at being transformed and transformational, we're going to anchor ourselves in Second Corinthians chapters 3 and 4 today. Paul is writing to this congregation in Corinth, and he's actually defending his ministry to them. He contrasts how Moses interacted with the glory of God with the new and better way that God opened up to them and to us in Jesus. So rather than seeing the glory and having to cover our faces like Moses had to, we've been given this amazing gift of the Holy Spirit, the glory of God in us to move us towards transformation. And this is what Paul is referencing, just so we get some context, when he talks about having a veil over our face as Moses had to. So here in Second Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18 through to 4, verse 1, hear this. And we all, who with unveiled faces, like Moses, contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is Spirit. Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. What I find so interesting here is that the relationship we see in these chapters between transformation and the state of our heart. We're being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory. Well, that actually sounds as good as it can get, right? Like, who doesn't want to be transformed into more glory of God? We're changing, we're becoming more and more like the glorious sons and daughters of the King. So, why does he say that? Because of God's mercy, we have this ministry so we do not lose heart. What's this relationship between transformation and losing heart? Well, it's this: transformation means difficulty. Transformation means difficulty, and difficulty can mean transformation if we choose to let it work in us the way God intends it to. Otherwise, we can lose heart.
Brian, this is a reality that I know we've mentioned on other podcast episodes, but I'm so glad we're diving into this further today because we really like the idea of being on the other side of transformation. Being transformed is a positive concept, at least when I hear it. I think that's great. But what it takes to go through to get to that is almost always some sort of challenge. And so when we think about transformation, we forget that it's difficulty that is embedded in that process. So I'm really glad we're diving into this today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be quoting John Mark Comer and his book "Practicing the Way" a couple of times
Mm.
in this podcast, and I would really recommend it if you're listening. It's really great. We can probably put a link to that in the show notes somewhere.
Yes. Oh, I love this book. I'm excited that you're pulling from that today, Brian, and
Mm,
we'll definitely add a link in the show notes.
awesome. So here's one of the first things Comer says: when Jesus said, "Come and follow me," he was simultaneously saying there are some things we all must leave behind. Take up your cross was a way of saying that sacrifice was required. There are things we must die to, release, let go, Comer says. So, this process of taking up our cross, it really is the pathway of difficulty. Yes, it's glorious, like you mentioned, Heather. It's a positive thing. Yes, it's God's best for us, but it's difficult. Jesus isn't saying that we're, joining a club and he's the club president and we get all these benefits when we join and everything will be wonderful. He's actually asking us to carry an instrument of torture, humiliation, shame, and ultimately death right through the middle of our neighborhood. We must leave these things behind. We must carry some of the weight of changing our destiny from death to life. And the wonderful thing about this is that you and I don't have to muster up this change from our own resources, from my own willpower, from my own grit. It comes from the Lord, who is spirit, and it comes from his mercy. So it's a glorious yet laborious process. The Believer's Bible Commentary says this about this passage: this marvelous transforming process takes place from glory to glory, that is, from one degree of glory to another. It's not a matter of instant change. There's no experience in the Christian life that will reproduce his image in a moment. It is a process, not a crisis. It's not like the fading glory of the law, but an ever increasing glory. The power for this wonderful process is the Holy Spirit of God, just as by the Spirit of the Lord, as we behold the Lord of glory, study him, contemplate him, gaze on him adoringly, the Spirit of the Lord works in our life the marvelous miracle of the increasing conformity to Christ. End quote. That's transformation. Last month, we looked at transformation from Romans chapter 12. We spent some time looking at key words and the meanings of those words. You might want to check that podcast out if you missed it to get some further background on transformation. But I want to have us look briefly at the word transformed again, since it's used here in 2 Corinthians 3:18. The IVP New Testament commentary says the text reads, "And we who reflect the Lord's glory are being transformed into his likeness with ever increasing glory." The word transform means to take on a different form or appearance. It can refer to an outward change or, as here, to an inward change. The present tense denotes an ongoing process. We are constantly being transformed, literally transformed into the same image. And it's taken as a matter of course by many that the image that Paul is talking about here is, of course, Christ's image. So then, transformation for us is present tense, and it's an ongoing process. You and I are not fully transformed the moment we decide to act on Jesus' invitation to become his apprentices. It's this ongoing process. And as we know, and we'll see further as we talk about this, that this ongoing process is difficult, it's challenging, and it's painful. Comer notes there's no escaping pain. The spiritual practices are how we meet God in our pain and deepen our surrender to him, trusting God to do what he will when he will, says Comer. I think this is partially why some people bristle at the thought of calling things spiritual disciplines, actually. Like it it doesn't sound appealing. We can mistakenly view this as if it's an external kind of discipline. I'm being disciplined or punished for something I did wrong or a standard I'm not measuring up to. I'm not praying enough or something like that. But that's not in any way what is meant by spiritual disciplines like prayer or fasting or scripture reading, gathering with others. Rather, it's us choosing to live a life of discipline, much like an athlete would, or like a musician does, or a scientist, or, of course, a teacher. In order to become fluent at something, in other words, to be transformed in some way, I enter into practices or disciplines to acquire and develop that attribute or that trait that I'm working towards.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful to think about that the reason you're engaging in these disciplines is out of your own personal desires to become more of what you want to be. Thinking back to my initial statement before about learning Spanish, it is a discipline, and it'd be easy for someone to say, "Wait a minute!" Like when I just said I don't do it except for at night. Quickly, you aren't trying to talk to people in Spanish and actually put it into practice.
Mm,
And they would say they could rightfully say, "It sounds like you don't really want to learn Spanish." And there's a lot of truth to that. Is that I'm not putting it as a high priority. And if you actually have it as a high priority in your life, you would focus on doing that out of a desire in your own heart to do those things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is that losing heart piece, right? Like if you're just kind of grinding your way through it, you don't have an idea of what's there. So as you're working through your Duolingo stuff there, Kian, have you ever gotten to the point where you're like, I just want to give up. I've lost heart with this.
Oh, for sure. I've given up many times. I took Spanish in high school and definitely gave up then too. um, so hopefully this time it sticks. But yeah, you gotta keep going. And then when I give up, I give up for a long time, and then trying to get back into it, you've lost everything, all the progress you've made. There might be some things there deep down, but for the most part, you're starting over.
Mm. I think it's so helpful that we're looking at this in terms of everyday things. So whether it's doing Duolingo or working out or getting to bed by a certain time, these are all discipline things. How that transfers over then to spiritual disciplines is interesting. And I think we can sometimes, at least I can feel a pressure to just be able to do all the disciplines fully and regularly. But just like the other disciplines of, say, hitting a regular bedtime or working out or whatever, we need time to grow those routines and we won't just be perfect at doing them consistently right away. But also, Brian, as we talk about challenges and difficulties, I think it's interesting, there's certainly challenges that come with establishing rhythms in spiritual disciplines or other disciplines, but this feels like a different kind of challenge than things that happen in our lives that maybe seem to happen to us, whether it's tragedy or relational friction or floods or, things that just pop up and varying levels of difficulty and the challenges that come from things that we choose, like disciplines, like what we're talking about, somehow seems easier to stomach to me than the challenges that just come out of nowhere or they could go on for years and challenges that seem unfair or sometimes even just debilitating. So we have these different kinds of challenges that we're talking about here.
Hmm. Yeah, Heather, that's a really, really important point for us to consider and keep in mind. And Paul reminds us that it's because of God's mercy that we don't lose heart. And so he's anchoring it in the mercy of God. But there is more, and he's experiencing more. So let's read on a little further in Second Corinthians chapter 4 and see maybe again through Paul's life experience what's there for us. So Second Corinthians chapter 4, verses 6 to 10. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Christ, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. Second Corinthians 4 6 says that God made his light shine in our hearts, and Paul specifically refers back to the glory of God, that just as Moses' face was transformed by it, so our hearts receive the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. This is such a powerful thing. So now, like Peter, James, and John at the Transfiguration, we can be tempted to build like a really nice shelter or monument so that we can stay all sort of warm and cozy in this God's glory moment, right? And then Paul goes and brings us back to the present tense ongoing process of transformation. And what do we find there that Paul's experiencing? Difficulty. Like right there, difficulty. Hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. That's difficulty. That's the transformation process. You may feel that you're maybe hard pressed in your parenting right now, if you're listening to this. You may feel perplexed in your singleness right now. You may be feeling struck down. You didn't get what you thought was going to come, or you've been shamed in some way. Maybe even your classroom, if you're a teacher, is not what you hoped that they would be as a class together. And paradoxically, These difficulties we carry around with us are so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. Like that difficulty is that real. It shows up in our body just as it did in Jesus' body. He sweat blood in prayer for us and in anticipation of the cross. And we're made in the image of God. We are fully integrated beings. And so what happens in our hearts impacts our bodies as well as our minds and emotions.
Let's take a short break for a story from the field.
I was born in Venezuela and I shared Venezuelan and Spanish culture. After living in some different countries and continents, 3 years ago, God brought me to Romania. In my Spanish class, I had a student really struggling with the class and especially with behavior. He was being very disrespectful, and it got to the point where I had to request a meeting with the mother, and even whether he could stay in the class or not, and if he wouldn't graduate. In the meeting, the mother shared some really difficult things he was going through at home. And in the moment, I felt that God was prompting me to share a little bit of my own story. How I came from a broken family since I was 2, and how I lost my mother when I was just 15 years old after years of cancer fight, and how God brought me and my sisters through it. And I felt God telling me to give him grace and another chance. And you know what? He changed. He started improving his grades. He started interacting in the class and getting involved in it. A few months later, I saw him working on a local church with a younger kids ministry. He was also being mentored by an older man I know in the church, and God transformed him completely. And I can't wait to see how God will use him to work in Romania through his life.
It's so encouraging to hear how God used the really hard circumstance that Ruth went through to allow her to connect with her students.
I agree. For our weekly spotlight this week, we're focusing on Asuncion Christian Academy in Asuncion, Paraguay. If you'd like to learn more about this school or other openings with Teach Beyond, visit teachbeyond.org/go.
And now, back to our conversation with Brian. Brian, could you talk to us about what does it look like when we actually lean into the challenge of transformation, into the discipline of it, how it might shape our heart or shapes our whole body response?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question, Kian. I think Comer gives us a good way of assessing transformation. He actually sort of asks us our own reflection question here. He says, are you growing in love, not just for your friends and family, but for your enemies? When you're hurt, wounded, and treated unjustly, as we all are you finding yourself increasingly able to emotionally release the bitterness, to absorb the pain and not to give it back in kind, to pray for and even bless those who curse you, Comer says. I think this is a really practical and helpful way for us to look at and gauge our transformation. Am I responding differently and reacting differently than I used to? Spiritual growth and transformation doesn't mean we have like fewer and fewer challenges. It means that when the challenges come, when I'm hard pressed, for example, my response is that it's more like Jesus. There's the fruit of the Spirit there. I don't lose heart. I'm able to keep moving forward in the
Mm.
progress that God longs for me to have.
Mm, yeah. What a good point that spiritual growth and transformation don't actually mean that we have fewer challenges. I
Yeah.
think that many times we don't realize how much we're living our lives in pursuit of comfort, avoiding pain, asking that problems be removed from our lives, praying to avoid those. And I think even those of us who claim to have a biblical worldview can get caught up in that trap of pursuing happiness above transformation. It's so nuanced and just so close together. And I just had a conversation with a friend recently about the Lord's Prayer, and that the phrase "Your kingdom come" is a prayer for
Mm,
us to see things on earth as it is in heaven. So, Jesus models this for us, and we can be asking the Lord for healing, for financial provision, for him to meet a need, but we also need the other part of that prayer, that is, your kingdom come, your will be done. Because ultimately we have the model of Christ who prayed in the garden, if it's possible, take this cup from me, not my will, but yours be done. So he's praying and asking for something to be removed that he knows will be difficult, and also submits to the will of the Father. So we're invited in scripture to bring our requests to him. We hold that intention with the reality that the human life is full of challenges, and the goal is not always to avoid them or just get rid of them. And that is really hard to wrap our minds around, but that our pursuit is transformation and allowing Christ to grow us, and not just to have a good life, to have a happy, contented life.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus praying that your will be done. Because in the end, God's will was Christ being crucified. And just
Mm,
God's will is not necessarily a path of comfort.
yeah.
Um, as we're talking about challenges and Christians facing challenges, one thing I struggle with in these conversations is growing up in the 90s and today is there is all these conversations about Christians versus the secular world, the outside world, and how Christians are oppressed. And this is coming from within America. So not a global Christian oppression, but American oppression. And then looking back at the 90s when I was growing up and being like, wait a minute, actually Christians were in a lot of those positions of authority, had a lot of power. So certainly there were people who did not like Christians who might have disparaged Christians, but really Christians were not facing challenges as a institution in America. So how do we look at those things and figure out what are challenges and suffering that are legitimate because of our rightly held Christian beliefs, and what are other things that are maybe noise in the background or things like that?
Yeah. Well, that's a great and multi-layered question, Kian, and I'm sure we may not get fully to the bottom of this, but let's start somewhere that will be helpful. And I think it's so important that we understand the heart of these issues. So if we take Paul for example again, do we think about his context? We think about his life. Um, he's elaborating in Second Corinthians 4 that what he's experiencing is from Paul speaking about Jesus and his kingdom, just like you mentioned, Heather, in the Lord's Prayer. And that kingdom naturally challenged the emperor worship, for example, and the whole panorama of gods that were worshiped in the Greco Roman culture of Corinth, right where Paul's walking down the street. But that's not the same as viewing everyone who doesn't believe what I believe as a threat, which is what you might have felt sort of was happening from the secular world when you were younger. And I just did air quotes on a podcast, but I think you know what meant around with that term secular. So does Paul model somebody who's living in fear of what might happen? Like what if we lose control? Well, no, he doesn't do that at all. In fact, we see in Paul on more than one occasion that others challenged him. They were concerned that something bad might happen to him. Like, don't go to Jerusalem. Don't do this because these things could happen. And he challenges these things based on his trust and familiarity with the leading of the Holy Spirit. And so he doesn't respond in fear that he needs to build some sort of defense system against evil. And this can happen to us on a personal level too. And we can apply this on a personal level. Why am I, as an individual, suffering? That's an important question. Am I suffering because I'm doing things that are contrary to God's best design for my life? Or am I suffering because I'm doing things that are going to reveal his greater glory? So when Paul looks at his own life and shares it with his friends in Corinth, he's well aware of his own suffering. In fact, he says that his suffering is for their benefit and the benefit of others, but it's not in a masochistic kind of way. We can see this if we look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 15 to 18. All this is for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. And again, this phrase, therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So Paul doesn't somehow live in some altered reality. He doesn't deny the difficulties he's facing. Outwardly, we are wasting away. Like, he is experiencing this. That's pretty clear. Yet once again, he comes to this phrase that he's used twice already: we do not lose heart. In the transformation process, we don't run towards difficulties or foolishly seek out persecution or ridicule. This is not the life that Jesus modeled for us at all. There's some wonderful insight from African theologian Isiaka Coulibaly, and he gives it to us in the African Bible commentary on this passage. And I'd just love to share that with you guys. So Coulibaly says this: should we conclude from this that the Bible calls believers to go out of their way to attract unfair treatment and persecution? Does it encourage them to seek out suffering in the hope of gaining some benefit? No, he says. None of what has been said suggests that suffering is good in itself. No one can tell the sick that their sickness is a blessing because something good will come of it. Nor can we tell refugees that they should be happy to have experienced war because God can and will change their situation. No, suffering is an evil that we should fight with all our strength. This is why the Bible teaches that there will be no pain and suffering in the new world order that God will set up at the return of the Lord Jesus Christ, Revelation 7 and Revelation 21.
Yeah. Oh, it's such an important point that it's not, oh, well, suffering's going to happen and that's actually a good thing. Like the suffering isn't the good part. It's the transformation that happens through that. That's such an important point here.
Yeah, suffering itself is not the purpose. Like, if that were the case, God would be tremendously cruel. Like, if watching us suffer was the purpose. And actually, this is what many people think about when they think about God, because they're learning to know him and they don't know him as well as they could yet. You know, people will say, if God really loved me, then this difficult thing or that tragic loss never would have happened. God could have stopped it. And we need to be aware of our own thoughts about God in suffering and in difficulty. And this is hard. Again, this not in the sense of God being punitive, but so that we don't lose heart by actually listening to lies about the character and nature of God. Again, Comer's really helpful here. James tells us to consider it pure joy, he says, when we face trials of many kinds, because they generate perseverance in us and in time maturity. Paul writes that perseverance will in turn create character, and character hope. Peter urges us to greatly rejoice in our trials because they're like a refining fire, burning off the dross to reveal the gold. End of quote from Comer. But God has good outcomes for us in mind. Our transformation through difficulties, our growth in joy, perseverance, character, hope, and being refined to reveal the glory of God. And what happens in this refining process? It's a process to remove anything that shouldn't be there. The junk is removed and the genuine nature of something comes into full view. That's the analogy of revealing the gold of God's presence and fullness in our life.
That's so good and so hard because the refining process is hard.
Yeah,
It's easy to become discouraged or to feel isolated when you're going through that. And so what can someone actually do when they are facing these difficulties?
yeah.
Oh, Kian's asking the practical question here. This is great.
Kian, it's such a good question. And I think it's something we need to really almost take a breath and consider before we give like a really quick response. Because sometimes we give something that can feel glib, and we know God's not glib, and we know his heart towards us is not glib, and his words not glib. So um, let's again stick with Paul here in his reality. And he gives us one important answer in chapter 3 of Second Corinthians. He talks about community. And he mentions the heart again in verse 2. He said, "You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts." He goes on to say, verse 4, "Such confidence we have through Christ before God. Not that we're competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. He's made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life." You are our letter written on our hearts, he says. So the transformation Paul is writing about is written on their hearts. They've changed, been transformed as a result of following Jesus. But not simply following Jesus in sort of grassy meadows of flowers. They've seen how difficult following Jesus is by watching Paul's own life. So our sufferings, our difficulties do more actually than transform us as individuals. They can transform our friends and our family, our community, as we share and as we journey through these experiences together.
Yeah, and especially we've been talking about how authenticity and like being genuine about what we're going through can resonate so deeply with other people and especially in today's generation. And
Yeah,
that doesn't mean we have to bare our souls about all the difficulties we're going through as we're going through them to everyone, right? But it
right.
does mean that being vulnerable about the things that we're walking through can lead to others experiencing transformation as we see the power of God in us.
Yeah. And how often that shows up in community, Heather. When you're
Mm-hmm.
walking through these things with people who either know you or people who you choose to share this difficulty with, you know, eh, and that's hard. It's really hard when you've experienced a hard thing or when you're going through these challenges to open up to community and say, let us be formed together in the midst of this,
Mhm.
is a
Mhm.
beautiful and powerful thing.
Mhm.
One final quote from from Comer in Practicing the Way. He says, "You can grow into a person of happiness even in times of great suffering. The kind of person who's not afraid of suffering or even of death, who's free of the emotional need for things to go your way. You can fulfill your purpose," he says, again, referencing back to what's God's purpose in my life. And these are the characteristics of a transformed life. It's this outcome of choosing disciplines as the pathway to transformation. It's not instant happiness and unicorns and rainbows. It's walking with God through these difficult times. And we know that difficulties are a given if we follow Jesus. Maybe where you're sitting as our listener today, you don't want to hear that right now. You don't want to hear that there are going to be difficulties following Jesus. But it is true. And with all the compassion we can say, it is true. But they're not difficulties of suffering for the sake of suffering. Not at all. To follow Jesus does require us to leave something behind. But when we follow Jesus in this way, we're seen by God and by others. The NIV Study Bible says that in us being this letter known and read by everyone, the Corinthians actually demonstrate the power of the gospel by their transformed lives. It's in walking through these difficulties that transformation becomes so much more visible. It reveals the genuine power of the gospel in the midst of my difficulties, in the midst of our suffering together. And yet, in these challenges, in an amazing way, we do not lose heart. And, if you're listening and you're in the midst of a really hard season, maybe you just recently experienced something challenging or entered into a hard circumstance totally unexpectedly, a diagnosis, a loss, you may find it hard to believe some of the things that we've just talked about today. And we have all been in that place. And what I would love to do for our listeners is be able to sit down over a cup of coffee and just hear more of your story and just sit in that moment. I think sometimes we we don't honor space enough. We feel like we need to have a quick solution. Here's a Bible verse, as good as Bible verses are, or let me just quickly pray with you and everything will be okay. And there's lots of stuff that takes a long time. And we're still on this side of God making all things new. There's some things that we will never see fixed until Jesus comes and makes all things right. But my prayer for us as we're together is that you will find this peace and foundation anchored in the things that we talked about at the very beginning of this podcast, that God is in control. Like he is sovereign. He sees you and he's also running the universe the way he wants it run in a good way, ultimately, because God is not just sovereign, he is good. And we can rest in that so that we don't lose heart.
Yeah, such good reminders, Brian. And you always leave us with a reflection question as we conclude the month. So there's a lot that we can reflect on when it comes to this. And maybe this will look different depending on where we are with experiencing difficulty right now. But what question do you want to leave us with today?
Yeah. Um, it's this question between you and the God of the universe who sees you and knows you and loves you. And it's the question of what are you wanting to transform in my life right now as I face this difficulty? The difficulties come in various sizes. We've already talked about that, but maybe it's just leaning into that simple discipline of flossing my teeth and taking care of my health. Or maybe it's much, much, much more. But um, asking God, what do you want to transform in my life right now as I face this difficulty? One further book recommendation too: Tim Keller's book, "Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering," is an excellent book. If you want to read more deeply in this material, it's really helped me grow as I processed some pain that I've had in my life that's been really, really deep. And he writes from a place of understanding as well.
That's good. Those are really good questions and good book recommendations to really dive into this in a way that we can't. It's hard to dive in so deeply in a short podcast, but just processing challenges and grief and God's will through that. Thank you, Brian, for sharing with us this week. Every week on the show, before we let you go, finally, we always ask you what's one thing that's changing your life right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so this can be something big or something light, depending on where you want to go with it. And after this topic, you are free to go whichever way you want. I'm going to go. Mine is a lighter one this week, so maybe that's helpful. I'm not sure. But what's changing my life is I have a sticker door. So my kids get tons of
Hmm.
stickers, and they end up on just random things all over the place. And so I have wrapped a door in brown paper, and we now put all the stickers on there,
Yes.
and it is really fun. I also am a
That's a
person who
cool idea.
loves, yeah, I'm a person who loves like walking down the street in a city and seeing the little electrical boxes just covered in stickers. I think that looks really cool. So I'm trying to recreate that in my office on a door. So
I love
So
that.
that's what I've been
good.
doing.
And then maybe they don't end up just all over the house too, right? It like, cleans things up, but also creates a cool piece of art in the meantime.
Stuck to
Exactly.
the table somewhere. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. That's so fun. Well, what's changing my life this week? Actually, this is more on topic than I even realized that it might be. I am maybe late to the game on this as I'm in my mid 30s, but I am leaning in more to strength training. And so I am just on the early end of this journey, but a friend of mine recommended a functional strength training online plan, and it's been really good to start building that up. And like I said, I'm still in the early process of that, but the thought of discipline and moving through things that are challenging, I think is always good for us, whether it's in a big or maybe small way like this. So
Hmm.
that's what's
Yeah.
changing my life lately. What about
That's
you,
great.
Brian?
Awesome, Heather. Yeah. Um, for me, it's pretty personal, but God is walking me through the difficulty of having a rare non-cancerous tumor.
Mm,
And so I'm learning to walk patiently through the treatment plan for that. And
mm,
God's helping me see him through this daily reminder of what's going on in my body, that
mm,
he's there, that he sees me, that he's enough, and that I'm in his care. So
mm.
yeah, it
There
varies.
Yeah, there's so much room to know him and experience spiritual growth and development in the process of seeing that through challenge in our physical bodies. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Brian. And, as you're walking through that, that informs your perspectives. And even as we've talked about this topic today. So we appreciate you sharing with us what you're learning in that place.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And I love how God sort of led our conversation today to have like the really small, simple things that are just like little challenges. And then there's some bigger stuff that we're dealing with, or our listeners are dealing with for sure. And I think recognizing that God is there in all of that. He loves us dearly and has nothing but the best intentions for us, to have us become all that he intends. It's good, but it sure looks different from moment to moment and person to person sometimes.
Kian, Brian, and I serve with an organization called Teach Beyond. Education plays a big role in missions, and Teach Beyond is a part of that.
As followers of Jesus, Teach Beyond is a global community providing transformational education services as part of God's ongoing mission to transform individuals and communities into all he intends.
Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we would love it if you would leave a rating or review and share the show with a friend. And we'll be starting our Advent series next week, so be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform you listen so you don't miss that episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.